Nick Shannon, over to you.
Well, welcome everyone, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome Harry Procter to speak to you today. Harry Procter is a professor of psychology, a contributing author to the Handbook on Dialectical Thinking, and a specialist in family systems therapy, and particularly personal construct psychology, which is perhaps a lesser known branch of psychology, started by the psychologist George Kelly in the 1950s, I think it was,
Yeah.
and probably a forerunner to the constructionists, because Kelly coined the term construing, and pointed to the way that human beings construe or make sense of their existence using constructs which are typically bipolar. In other words, there's no good without some bad on the other side. And that obviously provides interesting ground for dialectical thinking. And Harry has found a particular way to apply that within family systems therapy. And the important thing here is that the techniques that Harry uses for family systems therapy are equally applicable to working with teams and with other groups. So I think it has a broad application. So very much look forward to hearing from Harry, and so glad to be here just in time for today's session to say that. Thank you, everybody, and over to you, Harry.
Thanks very much, Nick. Very relieved to see you landed safely. I'm just going to share my screen. So, I move that bar down. Will that green and red bit disappear after a bit, or can I move it away? Oh, that's better. Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's really good to see you. And what I need to do is to give you a bit of a flavour of the work that I did in working with families over many years. I did psychology at Bristol and became interested. George Kelly's personal construct theory was mentioned in a number of different different parts of psychology. So that began to make sense to me, how people make sense. And I was also interested in families. And so bringing the two together has been the basis of my work. What I'm going to cover today, how do I, just trying to, yes. On this slide, I've just put the topics that I'm going to cover. I probably won't cover it all because there's a lot there, but I am making the slides available. So you'll be able to make more sense of what some of these terms mean later on, and at your leisure after the session. So as Nick mentioned, I'm basically combining personal construct theory from George Kelly with family systems approach. And in that, in those years during the 60s, people like R.D. Laing were writing about families and schizophrenia. And there was the growth of family therapy through the 50s and into the 60s onwards. which made a lot of sense to me using the systems approach to looking at family relationships. So that was the basis of my PhD, which I went on to do, which many of the concepts have their birth in that dissertation. To just sort of place the model, there, if we take the word constructivism, just trying to get rid of that thing. Is it possible to get rid of this? Yeah, it's better. I've put personal construct psychology in the middle as a sort of compromise between social constructionism and radical constructivism. People like Maturana and Varela were talking at a more biological level, and Vygotsky and Schotter, as examples of social constructionism, were talking about how individuals internalize the language and culture. And it always seemed to me that we needed both. So we're already beginning to think dialectically here between the opposites of personal versus social, if you like. So we obviously learn our language from the culture, but we make our own sense of everything, that there's no sort of passivity in the way that an individual receives the information and the material from the culture and the language. And that's emphasized by Kelly in Personal Construct Psychology. Kelly wrote in the form of a fundamental postulate and a number of corollaries, and his fundamental postulate says a person's processes are channelized by the way in which he or she anticipates events. So it's important that this model really emphasizes the future rather than the past. If we look at psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis in particular, and behavioral approaches, which were the two main models in which Kelly was working through the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, when he brought out his two 1955 volumes, The Psychology of Personal Constructs. So what he's emphasizing here is that in therapy, the way that people are anticipating the future, what they're aiming for, is a very important thing. Rather than, I mean, I know that psychoanalysis is an enormously subtle approach, but it can be understood as emphasizing the past and making, in a rather deterministic way, that past events affect future events. And it's really in current construing that we understand a person's life path to be governed, if you like. Haley emphasized that everybody is unique. So he writes, there are many, or I've summarized, there are many alternative ways of construing the world. This is what he called his philosophy of constructive alternativism. That however similar, even identical twins in a family always have their unique way of looking at the world. And indeed, my friend Mikael Lehmann, who's here tonight, has been examining pre-birth experience. And there's some very interesting research looking at the way that typical ways of interacting between two twins in the uterus are already beginning to indicate their different characteristics, with the relationship between them. For instance, one of them taking on a sort of role of a good twin versus a bad twin, with the good one being rather sort of domineering. That pattern is already beginning to show. So this uniqueness is very, very deep and fundamental and central to this model. It's also got an optimistic aspect in that he argues there that our present interpretations are always subject to revision. So we're not stuck with stuff so strongly, and we can always find a different way of looking at things, which makes an enormous difference to our lives. There's rather a nice quote from Bakhtin there, the Russian literary theorist, who also talks about uniqueness. My uniqueness is given. It is really actualized by me as uniqueness. It is always in the act, in the performed deed. I am actual and irreplaceable, and therefore must actualize my uniqueness. It fits in nicely with constructive review. So as Nick briefly mentioned, Kelly says that we make sense of the world through constructs, which he saw as bipolar. There's always a contrast. So a construct is a way that two elements are similar and contrast with a third. There must therefore always be three elements in the context. And this is different from the term class, where, as Kelly puts it, the opposing, the external aspect of the class covers both the irrelevant and the contrasting. And he thinks that it's very important to have, instead of just a concept like a class, to have a bipolar set of poles to make sense. So some examples here of here and there. So when I say this thing is here, I'm saying it's not there. When I say it's left, it's not right. If I'm saying it's large, I'm simultaneously saying it is not small, or construing that it is not small. Likewise with up and down and hard and soft. And I've listed those particular examples of constructs because it's quite clear that animals can remember whether something is to the left or the right, or here or over there, large or small, but they don't have any language. So the argument is that the construing is not the same as the language. Although language provides huge amounts of meaning, it is possible to have meaning without language. So we see a construct as a tool that sets up a discrimination, a cleavage of a continuum, enabling a judgment to be made, an action to be performed, or a position to be taken, which is going to be important. So we use these constructs to make interpretations, to make judgments, and we're able to choose one pole over the other. So there is an element of free choice in this model. Again, there's a dialectic between freedom and determinism in the model, in that Kelly says they're two sides of the same coin. So a construct provides two alternatives. So using that word channel, we're channelized into seeing something with a particular construct, but we also within that have the choice to see ourselves or see anything as coming under one pole or the other. And these two poles can construct a dimension. So I hear that's a dimension along which we can move. The background to philosophy here, which I cover in my chapter in the Handbook. So Hegel talks about how there's a determinacy. Determinacy implies negation in the way that I've been saying. Charles Peirce, the pragmatist, who I'm drawing a lot of work from in the current book that I'm writing, says we can first recognize any character only by putting an object which possesses it into comparison with an object which possesses it not. Using his 19th century English. The conception, therefore, which is quite universal in every respect, would be unrecognizable. There has to be this contrast or this distinction. And from a different school of thought altogether, we have Wittgenstein saying every word in the language signifies something. We have so far said nothing whatever unless we've explained exactly what distinction we want to make. Now, the construct can be misunderstood as being rather a sort of academic or an intellectual thing. And it's the very reverse. It underlies all our different functions. And I put this diagram to say that a construct underlies all these different things. So for instance, when we sense something, we're sensing, let's say, a color as opposed to a different color. When we have a view on something, we are seeing something as opposed to something else. We are seeing an object as opposed to its outside. We see the figure as opposed to the ground. When we make a judgment, also, we're using a construct. When we evaluate something, when we feel something. So there's no distinction in Kelly's thinking between cognition and emotion and action. These things are seen as all one thing. Doesn't mean it isn't sometimes useful to cleave that continuum, to concentrate on an aspect, but fundamentally, there's a unity of all these things. So when we tell a story, we communicate constructs. Discourse can be analysed into constructs, etc. And here again, we have the idea that it involves a choice. So to bring things into a family context, suppose I see a family and the father is worried about his son and he wants to know, is he ill or is he normal? So that is a construct that he's using that makes sense to him as a pair of alternatives. And this makes a great deal of difference. He's looking at either a medical or a moral construction, perhaps. Is the behavior that he's portraying, is it bad behavior? Is it something, is he being naughty or something? So there's a very important construct, which of course governs a totally different way of relating to that person. If somebody is ill, we obviously draw on medical solutions such as medication. If you're construing their actions as being more of this moral type, then we might be appealing to him to behave differently. So here again, a construct is two-ended. So a construct is two-ended. So an example I have here is that the father uses the word civil. He says to his son, why can't you behave in a civil way rather than be so rude all the time? And the son says, when you say civil, that's dishonest. When I speak, I want to be honest. So the same word there, civil, used by the father and used by the son, takes on a totally different meaning when we look at the contrast that is being made. And that's a very fundamental thing, of course, in interviewing families, interviewing anyone. What sense are you making here? Can you give me an example of what is not civil, for instance? Or can you give me an example of dishonest? Now, a few years ago, quite a long time ago, my wife and I, Jane and I, wrote a paper looking at a very good play by Lord Byron called Cain, a Mystery, which is about the first family that ever existed, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And the play starts right at the beginning with Adam and Eve and Abel kneeling down to pray, and Cain visibly is not joining them. And they say, why don't you sit and pray? And he says, I don't believe in your God, you know. I believe that we should be questioning things rather than being sort of passive and just obeying a God like that. He was very defiant. And this is, we use this as an example of talking about what is a family construct. So what Kelly had talked about were personal constructs in individuals, but we can also apply construing to groups, of course. So I talk about a family construct system, and here is a very important family construct occurring in this family. And the important thing about it is, as this polarity shapes the interactions and the discourse of the family members. So in our families, I mean, I'm half German, so my mother was German, my father was English, and so these two cultures came together. And also in terms of religion, my father was more of a scientist, and my mother more of a devout Lutheran. brought up actually as a Methodist in Stuttgart, funnily enough. But she went to a Lutheran church in Newcastle on time where I grew up. So we have material from the maternal and the paternal family of origin coming together and making a new way of making the sense of the world via the family construct system. So people might say, well, you know, people are very different in the family. They don't share all the same ideas. So how do we relate the idea that there is some sort of construct system associated with the family with the personal construing? So in this, we may say that Adam and Eve and Abel have an idea, their position, which is a more religious position, and Cain, which is a more questioning sort of existential position, I would say. He was their personal construing. Of course, these three won't entirely agree, but if we put them together, at this point in time, they're saying you should have faith in us, you should pray, and not to do so is to sin. These are what Kelly calls the elements, the people that are fitted under this pole. Ourselves, we have faith in the Lord, and our son, unfortunately, is a sinner and he doesn't believe. Meanwhile, Cain has got a construct saying they are tame, they're so passive. You should be questioning things. This is how one should be. So this is his chief value. Incidentally, I have put under these slides links which you can click. If you're interested in taking a particular topic further, you can click on there when you get the slides, and it'll take you to the paper. So when we look at it, when I was doing my research on families, and I got a sample of families in which one member had been diagnosed as schizophrenic, because the idea these anti-psychiatrists had been talking about how schizophrenia may not just be a medical illness, it may be psychological, more psychological. So I thought I will test out some of these ideas by using personal construct theory to look at construing in these families. And we can, and by using what is called a repertory grid, some of you will be familiar with that, I'm sure. We can use a grid that actually contains constructs drawn from all four members. I chose four members as a way of structuring the research. So, for instance, the patient, that's Nigel in this case, has a construct of regular versus irregular, and has character versus lacking character. And these are correlated together on the repertory grid. And we can compare the different members of a construct on the same grid and see that to have character is correlating with being intellectual for the sister, being somebody who makes somebody happy rather than depressing for the mother. And the father, for instance, here is saying to go out a lot is related to being kind, and to never to go out is selfish, thinking of themselves. So this is a way in which one way of construing how the family's constructs link together in a system. You can chase it up further. I've also got this paper in German, so click on that if you want to look at the paper in German. Now, I was seeing a family, of course, I've been retired for 20 years now, so all this is a long time ago. And my current activities are more writing about the theory. But here I saw a family in which Andrew was a 13-year-old who'd been labeled as conduct disorder. So referred by a psychiatrist to me to work with the family. And 4 members of the family came. I always would try and what family therapists call convene the family. Often I would telephone the family and say, oh, Andrew's been referred to me. I often find it very useful to work with families of people that I see. Would it be possible what would you think about coming along, all of you, or those of you who feel that they would like to come at an appointment next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, you know, and they say, well, yeah, that'll be fine. And the people that came are the mother and her 2 children, and her recently, her new partner, who is now stepfather to the children. And at the end of the interview, this is one use of what I call the PEG, or the perceiver element grid. So rather than using numbers in the grid, I'm now using the actual language of the construing. So along the side here, we have the perceivers. So this is mother's perception of herself, which is blank. But she sees Andrew as being aggressive. I wish he was less aggressive, which is her version of a contrast pole. But she says, they are my kids. These 2 are my kids, with the implication, if you think about it, why would she say my kids, not his kids, you see, because she's thinking Tom is too heavy and restrictive with Andrew. She's already beginning to think what I would say is relationally rather than in terms of personality. So when she says he's aggressive, that's more of a personality word, perhaps. And here she's saying that Tom is heavy, but we're also beginning to talk about the relationship between them. So there's clearly some sort of pretty big conflict between them. Now, as I'll mention later, I often want to know what people are aiming for in the therapy. In other words, what's the goal of the therapy? I say, if we were to work together for a few more sessions, what would you want to achieve from that? And Andrew, his only contribution actually in terms of who he talked about, this was compiled by me at the end of a session. It wasn't taken in the session. I drew together the information in what I call a qualitative grid, or a particular type of qualitative grid called perceiver element grid. Kelly calls these the elements in that they're the object of the construing. So he says, I would like Tom to commit suicide. That was his goal. He moans all the time. He's a twat, which is a very rude word. I hate him. The only thing that Gemma, the sister, said, she's 9, she was drawing a nice picture of herself as an angel saying, be happy. So her response to what's going on around her is to say, why don't you lot just be happy? Tom himself says, Andrew is a very rude, cheeky, aggressive, disrespectful lad, and he spoils my house. This is mine now again. And his house is his house, and somehow Mother Andrew and Gemma are seen as being it's not our house, at least not at the moment. He does admit that he blows up. This is each of these diagonals is a self-concept. So the only one we have here is I blow up sometimes. It's my duty to bring them up as respectful and not to be soft like my wife is with them. So you can see that by gathering just the data which indicates construing of self or other, we can get a pretty good idea of this family. And what I say is that the family construing is the core of the it's what's governing the family's life and their experiences of each other and of themselves. It's interesting here that mother had nothing, that mother has something to say about 3 of them, but not about herself. Nobody's actually saying anything about her. And yet, from my point of view, she was the hub of the wheel. She was the one that was bringing these 2 parts of the family together. And so I sometimes use this grid as an example of a gender discrimination of quite an interesting type. We can talk about how, often the male's voices are more dominant in a family than a female's voices. But here we're talking about who is spoken about. there's also a gender difference. You could say that this session was dominated by issues around the males, whereas there was very little to be said about mother. So that suggests some possible therapeutic tasks that we might have, doesn't it? So I've mentioned these qualitative grids, and there are a number of different types. We've talked about the perceiver element grid. I won't bore you with going through all these now, but they are there and available. We'll be looking a little bit at where we make elements, the relationships, so that, oh no, sorry, that's this one, where dyads in the grid are the elements. So we could, and this is something that I got from Anthony Ryle, who did a lot of work on using repertory grids before developing what he's well known for, which is cognitive analytic therapy school. And he used relationships as elements in the grid. So if we took the previous one, it would be the relationship between each of the four with all the others. So the mother-father relationship, the mother-sister relationship, etc. So and that, I used that in my research, which was very helpful. And we'll look at a bit of that later. What I will show you is the event perceiver grid. So going back to the Cain and Abel story, what I did was, there's a part of the play which leads up to the tragic murder of Cain, who slays his brother Abel. And although this is just drama, you know, it's just literature, it's actually incredibly realistic. I won't have time to go into detail here, but what it does is it breaks down into a blow-by-blow account, literally, eventually, of the way the argument developed from, again, they're praying, just the two brothers are praying, and Cain, again, is uncomfortable about praying, and Abel says, come on, why don't you pray? And Cain objects and says, starts saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And he knocks they're both praying. One of them is, Abel is a shepherd, so he has, Cain is a tiller of the ground, so he has grains and things on his, as offerings on the altar. And Abel, I think, has a sheep to offer. And Cain is saying he really disagrees. He doesn't like the idea of, he says Abel's offering is reeking of blood. And the thing escalates into the murder. And so this is a very useful way of charting crises or very difficult events where there's big arguments or something like that. It slows everything down, and we can write it in. And what was the next thing? And what we use, this is Cain as a perceiver here. So that's why it's called an EPG, an event down the side, and the perceivers are on the top. So how Cain and Abel are seeing each situation as it arises. And we can use these grids in a number of different ways. One can use them with the family. I didn't tend to use them when seeing families. To my mind, therapy was usually best kept to ordinary conversation. But what I did do is to use a perceiver element grid in some work I did after I retired, in which I was consulting to 4 therapy teams in the county, teams of people who were working with young people, or not necessarily young people, who were abusing drugs. So it's a drugs service. And one of these teams was having a lot of interpersonal difficulties. And I was asked to work with this family for, I think it was a 3-month period. And I said, well, if we work together, what would you like to achieve? And in this case, working with therapists, I thought I'm going to give them a peg, although I'm not going to ask them for how they see themselves and each other, as we did with Andrew and his family. I wanted to keep it positive. So I asked them, if we work together, and this is a typical thing I would say to a family or to a team, if we work together, I was scheduled to work with them monthly, I think. Actually, I think it was 6 months. So 6 months. If we work together and it turned out to be helpful, again, taking a very, not trying to promise any wonders, what would you like to achieve? Can you please say 3 ways in which you would be able to see yourself and all the other members of the team? Now, 2 members of this team had fallen out, something dreadful. They were arguing, and in the office where they all sat with their computers by this time, they were emailing each other, sort of criticizing each other, and the whole team was not functioning at all well. And so I asked them to think of 3 ways in which they would be able, if it was helpful, to see themselves and each other. I haven't actually included this grid in the slide set, but you can look at it on the reading list. What I had was a grid of 6 people. So 6 perceivers down the left, 6 elements, 6 as they perceived along the top. And in every cell, they had 3 comments to make, which were positive. So they were goals. So it was, they would be able to talk to me more easily, and, they would be more honest and stuff like that. So reading between the lines, all their goals, you could see what the problems, some of the problems were. They were saying of the manager, who was one of the therapists who was leading the team, that she should pull her weight more. She's being weak and this sort of thing. Although I said, let's just keep it. So they wouldn't put weak, because I'd asked them just to put the goal. So she would be stronger in dealing with the team, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's begin to think a little bit about actually working with families. And I've made a list. Oh, no, wait a minute. I beg your pardon. I have skipped on my notes here. So this comes from a school of thought called brief therapy, which is Václavic, Weekland, and Fish. And they interestingly defined a problem. What is a problem? And they said, well, life consists of difficulties that we apply solutions to, and they sort out, and we move on to the next issue in life. But they defined a problem as what happens when the attempted solution to the problem doesn't work. And so a new instance of the problem leads again to the same attempted solution. So the problem is seen very much as an interaction. If you like, there's a dialectic involved here between difficulty and the solution. This is one of the core ideas of systemic family therapy in this early phase. To contrast that, once we begin to get a bit of change, it then leads to more change. So this is, if you like, what we're aiming for in therapy, to begin to get a stuck situation that's going round and round in a circle, and to help them get on the move again, if you like. And one of the things that I emphasize in the work is flowing from what I call the goal peg, the thing that I did with the therapeutic teams. I would emphasize when things were going well. Therapy can all too easily just get into worshipping the problem, just thinking all the time about why it's there and what it feels like and all the rest of it. So taking a lead from a later worker, Michael White, he wanted to know what the exceptions were. So when you see somebody, if we were talking about Andrew's family, we might say, well, can you think of a time when Andrew and Tom were getting on a bit better? And they would say, well, yes, actually, they went out on Wednesday afternoon and they were okay. They got on quite well, and checked that out with them and everything. So instead of getting too problem focused, and obviously the solution focused school have taken this on in a strong way, also deriving from the original Václavic Mental Research Institute work. So when somebody might come in and say, well, things are better, and a problem-oriented therapist might say, oh, well, let's get back to talking about the problem. But I would want to focus at least as much time on when things are better as when they're difficult. It doesn't mean that you're not going to obviously listen to the suffering that's involved. You need to understand that. But you define the problem. Well, how are things better? And how have you managed it? So that implies that they have agency. They have the power to make things better. Now, applying that kind of logic to relationships, I developed a diagram which my good friend Richard, are you still with us, Richard? I don't think you'll be able to say because you'll be muted, but I can't see the audience and I don't want to come out of the slides because that'll waste time. But Richard, when we were working together in Bridgewater Day Hospital, as it was, Bridgewater Community Mental Health Team, he said, oh, that looks like a bow tie. And so the name of it was born, the bow tie diagram. And so here is another example of a family in which this girl, Janet, is basically the family's almost breaking down, social services are involved, and she's anorexic, to use a medical term. She's refusing food. She's got lots of difficulties and fears. And what we put here in the bow tie is at the construing level and the action level. So the idea is that the construct shapes the action. So Janet says of her mother, starting somewhere, this is a continuum, of course, she doesn't love me, she prefers my brother and sister and her grandchildren. And the hypothesis in drawing this diagram in the way is that her feelings are very much governed by this very strong family position that she's in. Meanwhile, the mother, construing these problems, says, I don't love her. She's ill and disabled. For this mother, this girl was somehow a broken toy. And she was, threatening to have her taken into care, and would take her along to the hospital accident and emergency regularly. So you can see here how this cycle, this loop of behavior, which was mentioned in the problem and solution circularity, can be elaborated into a diagram that shows you what the construing is of the members involved and what they do about it and how those actions feed back into the construing of the other. And that's a useful thing. I don't know if you think of people that perhaps you can think of somebody in your own family or friends or something where there's an argument that's not being resolved, or in your work with people. And it's quite helpful to draw this diagram out because it gives you somewhere to begin to choose to focus on for beginning to make some changes. So we have a choice of 4 places. Obviously, this is only 2 people at the moment, what I would call a dyad. Again, using a peg grid, we can use this with children now. And this is some work done by Stephen Stewart, who was a student on the clinical psychology course. And he used pegs to look at attention deficit disorder. And he was interested in the sons and father relationship in families where there was attention deficit disorder. And got as part of the research on single pieces of paper, but would be combined together into a perceiver element grid. And so this, the idea was there were two phases. So they would draw on the paper. This is father's drawing about himself, in which this is Aaron, the son, who's 10, I think, drawing how he sees himself, his father, and how he thinks his father sees him, and how his father sees himself. And he sees himself as a protector in the playground. He looks out for bullies and confronts them. He sees his father as being very much changing in his mood between a good day and a bad day. Sometimes he's great, sometimes he's like this ogre, this monster. He sees himself, how he thinks his dad sees him, as a troublemaker and destructive, put in tiny writing, perhaps suggesting that he felt really bad about what didn't want to think too much about how his father sees him, and how his father sees himself, triumphant, the bill payer, the boss of us. And Stephen got the two together. It was obviously ethically arranged beforehand that they would draw up these grids, either in language or in drawings. They would talk together and share their grids with each other, and then they would do a second grid to show the change. And the change that happened when these two got together, it was quite tense, but they actually began to look at each other with far more interpersonal understanding. And so even just putting on paper how these four views happen can be therapeutic in itself, by getting people to talk about it. Right, I've listed here some advantages of working with families. I'm a great fan of working with families in mental health. It seems to me that there's far too much emphasis on one-to-one work. The problem is really that to see the problem as residing in just one person, as I think maybe is becoming clear in the way I'm talking, is not the best way of looking. It's not to say that there aren't individual pathologies. Of course there are, when somebody's had a stroke or neurological problems and that sort of thing. But most of the people that come are, their difficulties are very much connected with their relational world. And even working with frankly neurological presentations of people, to work with the family is an incredibly useful thing to do. And the research shows actually that it's briefer. One can achieve change more quickly in working with people together. I'm going to speed up now because time is marching on, but you can look at these in more detail later. I've put how the process of personal construct family therapy, some of the tasks involved. And the first one I've put as constructive alternativism, which we talked about in the first slide, that everybody's unique. So that is a resource. So to give you an example of how that works, and you can look in this paper here, which has recently been translated into Russian as well, if there's any Russian people in the audience. I call this technique 1. First technique, this paper lists 14 techniques. So saying to the family when they arrive, you've moved them from the waiting room into the therapy room, and you can say to them, it's really good that you've been able to come today, because you know your situation far better than I do, and each of you has a different understanding of the situation. And what I can do, I hope, is to put all your understandings of the situation together, and that'll help me to get a deeper and broader understanding of your situation. So already we're beginning to use the idea of the uniqueness of people as being a resource, something that they can work together, hopefully. Obviously, often they're falling out. And so it's a way of saying that by bringing all their experiences together, that can be a very useful thing to do. Another way of enacting that idea is, if you like, when I use this metaphor of like a magnetic field, only we've got the problem and the goal. So if you think of perhaps a particularly chaotic family, or a family where there's a lot of disagreements, everybody's aiming for different things, and that's the jumble that is the family dysfunction. That's a dysfunctional family construct system, that people are just fighting with each other on how to do things. And that by putting the family into the magnetic field of problem versus goal, so asking them, what do you want to come here to work on particularly, and how would you like that to be when we've hopefully managed to have things go better for you? And so what you're doing is you're aligning them all, not necessarily having them agree that the problem's the same, but they're all working together. So, and then, if you like, once they're all aligned, then the metaphor says, well, then they can move forward. I haven't a lot more time because obviously we want to talk about things, but one of the things I have mentioned already is dyads, so pairs of people. And Kelly talked about professional constructs, that his model, he's mainly involved in trying to find out what his clients' constructs are, the way they're thinking. But he also stresses that it's very important for an approach to be reflexive. In other words, to take account of its own nature. So he is saying that not only the clients are seeing things in bipolar ways, but the therapists and the theorists are seeing things. So we can say that there's some useful professional constructs. That means professional relational constructs. So dyads tend to be two people being similar or different to each other, close or not emotionally close, agreeing with each other, understanding each other or not, or being up and down in a power hierarchy. And this leads to questions. So one of the things I had on the previous slide, I think, was we try and move things from the personal construing to relational construing, because relationships can be changed a lot more easily than sort of people's personalities, if you like. And relationships have an enormous power of how we behave at any point in time. Who we're with makes a great deal of difference, doesn't it? So there's a set of questions that we can examine a particular dyad using these standard things. But obviously, I would start off by saying, as in the list of questions that is available, how do you see the relationship between? And people often say, that's quite enough as a question, but then you can go into more detail looking at these different dimensions of relationships. But we're not just talking about dyads, of course. We're talking about more than two people. And often, as my good friend and colleague in Milan, who was taught by the Milan group, Valerio Gazio, she really emphasizes that any family construct, what she calls a semantic polarity, involves three people. So whenever two people in a family start to fall out, there tends to be a person who takes a mediating role. So in the Cain and Abel family, which was so rich in being able to express a lot of this stuff, we've got Cain doubting and questioning and being anti-religious against the rest of the family who wants obedience, etc. And Ada, who is the sister and also the wife of Cain, that's how the Eden family reproduced, according to Byron. So she's emphasizing a different thing there, saying the important thing is love. You don't need to agree with each other. You need to remember that you love each other. Which brings in the notion of triangles or triads. And if you think about all the words that there are, let me just say here, so we can have constructs which we call monadic constructs, for instance, personality attributes. Somebody's dangerous, not vulnerable, friendly, not versus critical. We can talk about dyads, as we just did on that previous slide, or we can begin to talk about triads. So A and B are making fun of C. There's no way of breaking down that triadic interaction into dyads. And Peirce gives the example of giving. Giving involves three things: the giver, the person who receives it, and the gift. And you can't just say, well, the gift was left on the table and the receiver picked him up. There's something about the concept of giving which is genuinely triadic, which describes three people. Another example is A introduces B to C. Or when somebody says to you, you know, I was talking to your friend the other day and he or she is really annoyed with you. That's a horrible thing to have to hear, isn't it? And because it involves three people, gives it this complexity that it's three people interacting there. And if we look at families, we can see that triangles figure so much in family difficulties in those well-known examples. Freud, of course, was the first to talk about the triangle with the Oedipus complex. J. Haley talked about a perverse triangle in which there was a coalition, what he says, across the levels of a hierarchy. So if you think of a teacher having a favorite in the a favorite pupil, how problematic that is. Or if you have a person aligning with one parent against the other, that sort of thing. And he said that in his paper Towards a Theory of Pathological Systems, that this, what he calls a perverse triangle, is important. This is an example of the questions that you can find in the reading list. At the end of the session, we'll often give a final message. And at the time we were working, and Alan and Richard, if they're still there, will remember all too well that we worked in teams with a one-way screen, and one person would interview the family, the team would observe, the therapist would leave after a bit and discuss with the team, and they would come back with what was known in the Milan team, which is of Salvini Palazzoli and her group in the 70s, a final intervention. So typically in a final intervention, we would get together, I would, as a therapist, go back in and say, rather like I said at the beginning, thank you. What each of you have said is really helpful. And then each of you is wanting to achieve, obviously personalizing this. This is still in the abstract here. And so each member in the intervention is framed as trying to improve or resolve the situation. So here is a family that I worked with 40 years ago. There's me with darker hair than I've got now. That man there was what's known in psychiatry as catatonic. He was completely mute. He'd been admitted to hospital completely mute, hadn't said a word for several sessions. Brother, adopted sister, father, mother, and adopted sister's husband. What had happened was that Bill, this guy, was quite a heavy, aggressive sort of guy, had intervened in an argument that was arising between Peter and his two parents, in which Peter would expect his mother to do stuff. This is the mother here. So Ruth, that's the adopted sister, says to her mother, "Why do you give in to him so much? He expects you to, he tells you that he wants his shoes cleaned, and she'll just go along, clean you. And I say, they're saying you waited on Peter too much. Ruth says, but Peter would say, just get my shoes cleaned. I want this done. And this escalated into a crisis in which the mother says, he got hold of my throat and he was going to murder me. So he's escalating into extreme violence. So mother's view of the mother-Peter relationship. Ruth's view, she waits on him. She should say, if I was dealing with Peter, I'd just say, now come on, Peter, they're your shoes, you clean them. The problem is that it's fine when Ruth or Bill are there, but when they're not there, this thing escalates into a crisis which resulted in him being admitted to the psychiatric hospital, and he went completely mute for several sessions. So I used, at that time, something that we began to feel was not particularly ethical because it was not particularly honest. And we moved on to using what Tom Anderson, the Norwegian family therapist, called the reflecting team later on. But at this time, we used what's known as the sacrifice intervention, which comes from this book, Paradox and Counter-Paradox, 1978. And the final intervention was that I went in and said, the team and I have been having some thoughts over the time we've been working with you. I'll try and explain our thinking. We don't consider Peter to be ill. We consider him to be deliberately keeping quiet for the following reasons. We think that he's quite aware of what he's doing, all right? And that he's doing it for generous purposes. We think that this has actually been going on for a tremendous length of time. He's been sacrificing himself and his development and his own life in order to help the rest of you. And this did not go down well. We didn't know it at the time, but when they left, there was a huge, great discussion in the family about what rubbish we'd spoken. However, a month later, they came along. And the first day I went to the waiting room and we went up 2 flights of steps up to the therapy room. And Peter's jabbering away. He hasn't spoken for 4 months. He says, I feel a lot better now. I go swimming, badminton, YMCA, everything, play football. I've been coming home to stay a few days at mum and dad's, still in hospital. So you've been doing the decorating, she says, the mother. Painting and decorating, the father says. Oh, I've been painting and decorating, done some painting and decorating. Bit of gardening, keeping busy. I say, well, there's only, after hearing all this, and they all said what rubbish we were talking about. And I said, well, when did Peter start coming out of himself? And it was immediately after the session in which we given that message. Anyone else got any thoughts on how the change has been achieved? Bill says, well, after last month, when you told me, that's when it started, from that day. When you told me that I forced Peter into hospital, that was your words, forced. I said, I don't think I said that. And I've checked the session. We've got this. This all comes from the recording. I didn't say that. He has construed what we said as a criticism of him. I had said nothing at the time. Interesting, they seem to have construed my statement that Peter chose to be there as them forcing him there. Oh, you did, says Bill. That's right, isn't it, Ruth? She says, well, not forced, but you said words to that effect. And I put this in, I mean, this is 40 years ago, just to show how extraordinarily powerful family therapy can be. Of course, this is an extreme example, but I do have another case actually of somebody who completely withdrew into themselves in this so-called catatonic way, which worked in a similar way. So the rest of the slides are about resources, so you can find this book that I wrote with David Winter, came out in 2020. Please buy one. This is what I'm working on at the moment. And here are some links, which you may find interesting and useful. There's some 5 teaching videos. You can get them on this link. So thank you very much for listening patiently. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Harry. Very fascinating, and I'm struck by just well, until the last piece, just how kind of subtle this type of intervention seems to be. And I was wondering how it fits with various different views on dialectical thinking, particularly the view that dialectical thinking is all about kind of transcending opposites,
Yes,
Aufheben, and resolving conflicts by moving to a kind of higher level. It struck me that there's more of what you do really in terms of directing attention, in other words, creating awareness in the family, and less in terms of interpretation,
yes,
and even less in terms of enactment, using Basker's and Mascolo's model of any kind of therapeutic intervention.
yeah.
Do you find any room for interpretation or and resolving these particular conflicts, or do you leave it at the point of creating awareness?
I would say that I want to be able to use anything, you know, quite eclectic. My practice, and I think Kellyan practice, is quite eclectic in that they're willing to use anything, but that it's subsumed under a set of values and methods in which to get close to how people actually are thinking and feeling and acting in terms of their constructs. So yes, I would want to use interpretation sometimes. There's no reason not to do stuff if it feels it's going to help in this situation. But I think the idea is that if you can get people to start talking to each other and not just fighting or arguing, but actually listen, so the session consists of respect to everybody and trying to bring them into better cooperation, then the problems will almost begin to move on themselves. You know, I mean, that last example was one in which the system really needed a big external intervention, maybe. But usually, I would find that a good family therapy session tended to lead the next time you see people as saying, well, actually, things have been a bit better, because you know, the session is designed to optimize and to get there. I would say there's a nice quote actually from Ernst Cassirer, the philosopher, who talks about the pregnance of what I would call a construct system. That, you know, the construct system that are offered to us in problematic situations are dysfunctional. But nevertheless, they're also, you know, anybody's construing, even the most limited person, anybody's construing consists of a huge richness, I believe, and that if we can begin to release those more positive aspects of people's contributions, then things can move forward. But I think the dialectic comes in really in seeing that there's often these opposed positions. And so one is obviously using that, and we have the bow tie thing, for instance, of finding ways of bringing them together and moving on, transforming the situation, because the current system has that pregnance, if you like. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes. I think we should throw the floor open to questions generally. Does anybody have a particular question? Would you like to put your hand up, either physically or digitally?
Zapros.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Nicely simple. I think we'll need to contrast your methods a little bit with those of Michaela Swales when she talks about dialectical behavior therapy in July. Would be an interesting contrast.
It wouldn't, from my point of view, it's not particularly productive for there to be an argument in the session. I would want to be saying, well, how would you want this relationship to be going differently? Or what is it that you want to get across to, A, what do you want to get across to B? What's the most important thing? So I'd be deconstructing the situation, if that makes sense. Just to, the idea that somehow the catharsis idea that to have a jolly good argument is a good thing, I don't really agree with at all. I won't say, well, what's making you say that? How would it work differently and that sort of thing? So I'd be quite active in working with tension and conflict. In this situation, us therapists come along, we do our best to understand, but they're in the situation. They've been in all their lives and they know all too well. I can remember one thing I used to do. If they start arguing, I would say, is this the way it is when you're at home? Can you give me an example where there was an argument at home? How did you manage to resolve it? There's nothing wrong with difference in itself, is there? Different points of view. The bad thing about it is when they start fighting dangerously.
Thank you, Harry.
I'm answering you quite, Igor. But I wanted to say to you, Igor, that we talked about Olga and your paper last time group in the dialectical, didn't we? And I was going to mention you today. I mean, I was going to mention quite a lot of things which I didn't have time to. But you actually mentioned Frankel's paradoxical intention, don't you? In that paper. which led to perhaps the Václavic group and J. Haley particularly using paradox, and Milton Erickson, the hypnotherapist. To my mind, there's a basic dialectic thing, and that is that I'm trying to understand the construing of somebody, but I'm also wanting to help them change it, because often that construing is leading to difficulties.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of double approach to things, in which Kelly says we should be very credulous and accepting of what people say. It's hopeless just to try and change somebody's mind by arguing with them. So just going to find out how they see things and then help them explore the implications of what that might lead to. That's a great question. I mean, there's a wonderful construct theorist who worked with children called Tom Ravenette, who I learned a huge amount from about how he related in a very playful, wonderful, playful way. But he wrote, people in general are not aware of their own constructs. So we could say that actually the construct system is part of the unconscious mind. I mean, Kelly doesn't want to make these strict divisions between, but we can, through reflection, come to know what our constructs are. Obviously, one of the techniques is to say, well, you know, if I asked you, how would you see yourself as who would you see yourself as more similar to, your mum or your dad? Who do you think are the two that are most similar? In doing that, you're using this word similarity and difference, but you're also giving it content. So, well, me and my mum, we're much more patient. And my dad is an impatient sort of person. He can't, you know, he starts getting very uncomfortable and wants to leave the room. So in a way, that's helped those people become aware of this distinction. But we can do that to ourselves, can't we? We can use any of these Kellyan techniques on ourselves. And one of the things Kelly wanted people to do at the beginning of sessions, often of therapy, was to write what he called a self-characterization. He said, can you please write a characterization of yourself, a story about yourself in the third person? He said, it's better if you do it in the third person, because we have certain inhibitions about using the first person, I am this or that. So write it from the point of view of a sympathetic friend. So they might start off and say, well, Harry's the sort of person who really X, Y, Z, you know. And then you can go through and you can underline the constructs that are coming out in the transcript and discuss them. You might say, well, what's the opposite of that? And all the rest of it. Do you know this book? Please look at the reading list. There's a lot on there. And, you know, I'm talking to everybody now. You know, it's not as well known as it should be. I worked in rather an obscure place in a small town. I am at the University of Hertfordshire as a visiting professor, but things have, you know, the onset of cognitive behavior therapy is such a big force, has been a problem for construct theory, which is, to my mind, it has some influence on CBT, actually. Beck particularly acknowledged Kelly, but you know, the idea of such emphasis on diagnostic categories and the best way of dealing with a particular diagnosis is unfortunate, as I think should be obvious from what I said. Anyone else want
Wonderful.
to?
Well, thank you. I think we should probably bring things to a close unless anybody has any burning issues. I'm kind of thinking in my head that if ever there was a system in transformation, it must be the family system. So thank you so much, Harry, for bringing this to our attention and also for showing us some interesting tools and techniques that are really useful for coaches.
We all have families, of course, and so I'm hoping that in talking it had you resonating and thinking, oh, this is ringing a bell.
I think I should just say a word about our next session, which Roman was here earlier on, but he had to leave early. But our next session will be Roman Angra. I've forgotten the date off the top of my head. I think it was June the 5th. Was that right? June the 5th? I think it's June the 5th. But check the website anyway. And Roman will talk about how his model of transcendental pluralism, which on the face of it is quite an abstract concept, but he will illustrate that with a couple of case studies and talk about how the recognition of patterns in the language people use can support effective coaching in terms of developing clients' dialectical thinking. That should be a very interesting session. Thank you, Bernard, for putting that in the chat. June the 5th, and it will be July the 7th will be Michaela Swales on dialectical behavior therapy. We've also then ended up with a couple of sessions, September the 9th. Daniel Medvedev, don't have a title there quite yet, but he's a futurologist, so he'll be inspiring us with his vision of the future, no doubt. And Igor and Olga Sheehan have agreed to do a session on the positional method in December. Got that to look forward to, and we're just looking for someone to fill the date of November the 5th, which is outstanding. 1 hour earlier than normal, or 2 hours earlier than normal, I think, Bernard, 5 p.m. CET. Yeah. So if anybody is keen to do a session, let us know, because that slot is currently open. I'll pass you back to Bernard, I think.
There's just one question left. You shortly shared the book Coaching Psychology. Could you give us the author again?
Jelena Pavlovich.
Pavlovich. Once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, for your wonderful
Thank you.
presentation, and thank you for the discourse. I think this is again and again a wonderful field where people come together to listen, to learn, to get impulses. See you again next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye to all.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you. Bye now.